second part of my talk, I'll make some broad connections to the current unpleasantness to see if we can draw on either one of them to get some insights into it. So the first interesting factoid about the Keynes-Hayek relationship is that Keynes was one of Hayek's heroes when he was a kid. Hayek grew up in Vienna, served in World War I as a young man. As soon as he got back from the war, he went to college. And so he was a college student at the University of Vienna, 1918, 1919, 1920. This was a terrible time. It was not only after the war, but there was difficulty getting food supplies, very cold winter. They were burning furniture for heat. And Keynes, of course, at this time had written this book that two others have alluded to, Economic Consequences of the Peace, talking about how the peace terms were just abhorrent. So he was a hero, Keynes was, to virtually everyone in Central Europe for his strong stand against the peace treaty, or the terms of the treaty. Now, there was a hyperinflation in Germany, but also in Austria right after the war due to the terms of the treaty. This was something that Hayek actually lived through, so he witnessed the ill effects of hyperinflation. Many people, basically it wiped out the savings of the middle class, and in many people's mind made possible the rise of fascism in Central Europe. So he saw the ill effects of inflation. And this would stay with him forever. Inflation, we'll see, becomes his real nemesis. The battle between Hayek and Keynes starts in 1931. Hayek is invited to the London School of Economics to give 4 lectures. He would eventually publish these as Prices in Production. People who knew him told him afterwards that no one could understand a word he was saying while he was giving his lectures. So this, of course, made it very attractive. We're talking academics here. I was impressed by that sort of thing. But he also was able to explain himself whenever questions were asked. So they gave him a job. They offered him a job, so he came to the LSE. And he arrives in 1931, summer of 1931, and he publishes a review of a book by John Maynard Keynes. This is not the general theory book. This is his earlier book, A Treatise on Money. Now, as we heard, Keynes was an important public figure right up to this time, but he felt that this book, A Treatise on Money, was going to make his name as a monetary theorist, a serious monetary theorist. So it was an important book for him. He worked on it for years. And Hayek wrote a review, and this is what started the big battle between them. And the grounds of the debate are fairly simple to establish. Both Hayek in his book Prices in Production and Keynes in Treatise on Money drew on the work of a Swedish economist named Knut Wicksell. Now, Knut Wicksell, though Swedish, wrote in German. He wrote 3 books in German. Hayek read German. Okay? Keynes read German. Here's what Keynes said this, kind of a fatally self-deprecating remark. He says this in his book, Treatise on Money. He says, in a footnote, in German I can only clearly understand what I know already. So Hayek sees this as an opening, and really it was almost as if Keynes had put a bullseye on his book. So Hayek's critique was quite simple. He pointed out that Keynes had borrowed some of Wicksell's framework, but had totally ignored this other big book that Wicksell had written earlier that had capital theory integrated into it. And as it turns out, in Hayek's book, capital theory was integrated beautifully. He had borrowed from all of Wicksell, not just the one single book. So he was able to say that basically, you've got 2 books in front of you. One of them kind of draws on Wicksell. The other one actually knows Wicksell. It was a polite but devastating attack, actually. Basically saying that Keynes had not done his homework. The Swedish economist with whom Hayek would share the Nobel 40 years later, Gunnar Myrdal, was less flattering. In talking about the Treatise on Money, he said, well, it reflected the British penchant for unnecessary originality, and made reference to not reading other languages. So you see the situation that Keynes is in. He's a public figure. This was supposed to be his big book. Along comes this kid. Hayek is 31 years old at this point. Young upstart from another country. This is the great slump of 1930 had just become the Great Depression, so there was a lot at stake, and this was the situation. So Keynes was apoplectic. his biographer said that he's got Keynes's papers arrayed in front of him. The review by Hayek was the thing that was the most marked up of any of Keynes's papers. I mean, he was writing all over it. No, wrong. Oh, he's got me wrong here. So, as is usual, he came up with a response. So the usual academic response is to write a reply. And Keynes wrote a reply that was published a few months later. And what was unusual, though, is you would think he would defend his own position. He does that a little bit, but soon in the reply, he launches an attack on Hayek's book. That's unprecedented. Okay, this is something quite different. And what an attack it was. I mean, Keynes was a wonderful writer. I'll just give you a little taste of it, of the general tone. This is Keynes writing about Hayek's book. The book as it stands seems to me to be one of the most frightful muddles I've ever read. Scarcely a sound proposition in it. It's an extraordinary example of how, starting with a mistake, a remorseless logician can end up in bedlam. Okay, so I mean, this is the tone that's going on, and it was unusual. A fellow Cambridge Don talked about the exchange later and likened it to bodyline bowling, which is a wonderful. There's a few cricket people out here, so this is where the bowler, instead of going for the wicket, goes for the body of the batsman. Okay, kind of brushing them back in baseball, only actually going for him. A very nice metaphor. Jake Viner said in a letter to a friend that he thought that Keynes's hack was very unmannerly, but kind of what he expected from Keynes. So it's a wonderful time. So that was the initial conflict. Both of them return to their corners, and they do what academics do. They both decide to write big books. Keynes finishes first. 1936, The General Theory comes out. Becomes the most important book in 20th century economics in terms of its influence on the profession and on policy making in economics. Hayek comes out with his book 5 years later, 1941. The war had already started. Nobody's buying books, let me tell you. And it's called The Pure Theory of Capital. And it's frankly unreadable. I read the entire thing, line for line, checking it. It's a terrible book, okay? And in any event, it was little read. Okay, so Hayek basically loses that battle. He goes on actually to write a book that becomes quite important and published just a few years later called The Road to Serfdom. So that becomes the book that he becomes known for. There's a final twist. The relationship between Hayek and Keynes becomes much better as the war begins, World War II begins. Hayek supported Keynes's How to Pay for the War. Kevin alluded to the fact that they both opposed price supports during the war and were trying to get that prevented. Keynes found Hayek some rooms at King's College in Cambridge. During the war, the LSE, which was in London, was evacuated to avoid the bombing, so Keynes was able to get him a place to stay. Something that I think most people would find very interesting was Keynes's response to The Road to Serfdom. You usually think of this book as being very different. And Keynes, on his way over to Bretton Woods, wrote Hayek. He was reading the book on the boat. And here's what he said. You'll not expect me to accept quite all the economic dicta in it, but morally and philosophically I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it. And not only in agreement, but in deeply moved agreement. Quite an amazing passage, that. Hayek, for his part, late in his life, had an interview where he was asked, who would you like to have a dinner conversation with? Pick the two people. And he said, well, John Maynard Keynes and Joseph Schumpeter. That these were the best, they were sparkling conversationalists and just fascinating people. So the relationship was actually quite a fascinating one, I think. And the remaining time, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and look briefly at what I see as some of the most important differences between Hayek and Keynes. And, of course, the analyses of the business cycle is going to be prominent. I think the first thing that I'd like to point out is the fact that both of them were fully cognizant of the fact that a market system is occasionally plagued by a business cycle. And I say this for two reasons. It almost seems as if the business cycle took people by surprise, like we weren't supposed to have business cycles anymore. You get this sense. It certainly would have surprised either of them. And also, Hayek is sometimes portrayed as somebody who thinks that markets always work fine. Hayek's first book was titled Monetary Theory and the Trade Cycle. Okay, he didn't think that markets are just always everything's going to be okay. he recognized him. He's not a Dr. Pangloss. Hayek's theory about the typical cycle is actually one that I'll just talk about very briefly, because it does kind of mirror at least some of the things that happened in the most recent downturn. In Hayek's theory, the problems start when the market rate of interest is held too low for too long. And when this occurs, and it's always viewed as a politically popular sort of policy, when this occurs, too much investment takes place. He used the term malinvestment. Too many investment projects get started that cannot ultimately be sustained. And when people realize what happens, or what has happened, investment spending collapses and a recession begins. And this, I think, is a plausible description of what happened recently, at least in part. For Hayek, recessions are the painful but necessary adjustment that returns the system to equilibrium. So here, of course, is where Hayek and Keynes really look at the thing differently. Because he thinks that the recession is a return of the system back to equilibrium, Hayek viewed any attempt to inject further stimulus as something that's just going to prolong the period of malinvestment. And he also said that what it sets up is the possibility of inflation, the one thing that, of course, he'd experienced as a youth as being quite dangerous. So Hayek's counsel was to simply sit back and let the system adjust, and it was about as politically popular then as it is today. Okay? I mean, this is not something that's going to get someone elected, which he never was. So, if we think about Hayek's fears about inflation, they didn't seem to materialize after. I mean, these are always complex events. They didn't seem to materialize after the Great Depression was over. That started the great period of Keynesian dominance, post-war period. Inflation did seem to raise its ugly head in the stagflation of the 1970s. This often is viewed as marking the ending of activist Keynesian policy in the United States. Which one of those two episodes has more relevance for the downturn of 2008 is anyone's guess. But we have had both experiences. The danger, is both Hayek and Keynes recognize, is if the stimulus goes for too long, because then that sets up that sort of inflationary period. So in many people's minds, the question boils down to this: will Washington have the requisite knowledge and political will to start reducing the stimulus at just the right time? And I think that's a scary question, okay? But that is the question, I think. The scary question brings us to the second and last difference that I'll draw between Keynes and Hayek, and it's beautifully captured by the Keynes' biographer, Sir Roy Harrod, who talked about the presuppositions of 6 Harvey Road. We heard about Keynes' life in Cambridge. Harvey Road, that was the Keynes household where his mother, the mayor, and father, the Don, and himself lived. And here's how Roy Harrod talked about those presuppositions. Reform in the larger as in the smaller sphere was to be achieved primarily and principally by the discussion of intelligent people. In all vital matters, their views would prevail. Public opinion would be wisely guided. Now, Keynes was supremely confident, as I think was reflected in the other comments, that he and a small group of Oxbridge-trained experts could manage the economy. And he was actually known during this period. He'd come out with one policy prescription. He's writing in these weeklies all the time. He'll come out with something. And he was known as somebody who was constantly changing his mind. In fact, the newspapers used to have fun with him. One had a cartoon of Keynes as the boneless man. And at the time of one particularly notorious flip-flop on whether there should be tariffs, the old joke about economists got a new twist. Whenever you have 5 economists gathered in a room, you have 6 different opinions, 2 of them held by Keynes. Okay? That was always a good one. Now, Hayek, for his part, took a different view. He was always talking about the limits of our reason, the hubris of reason, limits of our knowledge. We just don't have enough knowledge to guide something as complex as an economy. George Will recently took a Hayek quote that I'll repeat here. The curious task of economics, in Hayek's view, is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they imagine that they can design. He was also wary about the effects of government intervention on the ability of ordinary people to make decisions. Another very nice quote, this from The Road to Serfdom: the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. And I think if you think of the last 6 months, people keep wondering, what's going to happen? What's the package going to look like? Should I be investing this way or that way? Indecision about what the government's doing can, in fact, make it harder for people to make their own decisions. Now, taken by itself, Hayek's message about the limits of knowledge, I think, has to give any reasonable person pause. If you link it up with other arguments from the public choice literature about the difficulties of getting good policy out of a democratic political process, it may well give you further pause. So Hayek's message is depressing. Okay, it's basically a depressing message, and these are depressing times. These are serious times, and these are important questions. But this is also supposed to be the celebration of our new center and the Bloomsbury year. So I want to end on a note that's not quite so grim. So I'll tell you my favorite Keynes story, and it's one that was always my favorite, but it was particularly popular when I would teach undergraduates. This is the one that they really loved. It turns out that just before he died, Keynes sat for an interview, and the interviewer happened to ask, if you had your life to live over again, what would you do differently? And Keynes immediately responded, well, that's easy. I would have drunk more champagne. So we'll have some champagne. Thank you very much.